Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Sally Haslinger, and I am a professor at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf. I have a kind of burgundy sweater on and a scarf with mixed colors, including burgundy. And I wear glasses and I have short hair. So our sessions are 50 minutes long with 30 minutes for presentation and 20 minutes for discussion. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and I will moderate the discussion. I can't see you and I can't, I don't know who's here, but I'm interested in hearing all of your questions and I will then present them to Corinne. So speaking of whom, Corinne Lajoie is a PhD candidate at the Pennsylvania State University. They work in philosophy of disability, phenomenology, and feminist philosophy. Today, they will present their paper, The Senses of Access, and let's all welcome them. Let's all welcome them.
Thank you so much, Sally. Hello, everyone. My name is Corinne. I am a white, non-binary person. I have dark brown hair, glasses, and I'm wearing a gray sweater, and I've blurred my background. So before I switch over to my slides and paper, I just wanted to say thank you to Shelley and to Jonathan. This is my first time presenting, not my first time attending, but I've really enjoyed editions of this conference in the past. So I'm excited to hear thoughts about this paper. So I will share my screen. Okay. I've also included in the chat a link to my slides and to my paper, and that link should work until the end of the conference. So all of the slides, I only have an image on this first slide, which I'll describe, and the other slides include text that I'll be reading in the paper. So this first slide includes a stock image of some white arrows pointing upward against a green and orange or yellow background. All right, so I've changed the title of my paper to Access Problems Toward a Relational Model. I'm very excited to be presenting after August. I hope that we can kind of continue our discussion of access from the last presentation into this presentation. So I'll be reading my paper. In the current Post-Americans with Disabilities Act era in the United States, access is most often collapsed with the minimal provision of mandated accommodations. This approach functions on an individual case-by-case basis. The provision of accommodations in higher education functions as a telling example of this. The process of obtaining accommodations varies slightly across institutions of learning, but it consistently begins with the requirement to produce medical documentation for one's disability. Students must obtain this documentation prior to discussing the accommodations that are available to them. Following an intake interview with a counselor, students with documented disabilities are offered selected accommodations from a list of options established by the university. For example, a flexed attendance policy, allowance to take breaks during class, extended testing time, note-taking assistance, etc. Once they have been approved for these accommodations, students must come to an agreement about their provision with each instructor at the beginning of every semester. In the end, disabled students are expected to fall back in line and to recover the anonymity, what Rosemary Garland-Thompson calls the visual or material anonymity, afforded to normal, unmarked students in the classroom. Legalistic approaches to access are tied to an individualist ontology of the subject and, by extension, of disability. The individual subject figures as the primary unit of analysis within such frameworks. As a result, the question of access is thoroughly individualized. Access is framed as something which some persons have and others do not have, or more precisely, as something which some persons need and others do not need, on the basis of discretely identifiable corporeal and cognitive limitations. Access is a good offered to disabled people, most often by non-disabled people, in the form of legally mandated accommodations. Accommodations are provided to individual persons, they are suited to individual needs, and they remedy purportedly individual limitations that generate problems of fit. In some, legalistic approaches frame disability as a personal limitation that generates problems of fit, rather than as a social reality experienced within intersubjective worlds that assume non-disability as the norm. This widely accepted view of access raises several intractable issues. Notably, I have argued in earlier work that this model falls short phenomenologically on at least 5 counts. First, it misses the intersubjective sociality of being in the world and of being disabled in the world. Second, it prioritizes a narrow conception of access focused on physical space, physical access and physical space, a typology that I contest. Third, it approaches access as frozen in time or as a one-time fix, rather than as a temporally dynamic process. Fourth, it bureaucratizes and privatizes disability knowledge by devaluing disabled people's lived knowledge of their own body minds. And finally, fifth, it frames access as a technology for the reproduction of ability and of able-bodied worlds, and thus remains committed to the superiority of ability. More generally, this view of access conveniently relies on what non-disabled people imagine that disabled people need, and dismisses the experiential knowledge and expertise on access of disabled people themselves. As disabled activists have long argued, access that feels like the problem of disability has been dealt with is not liberatory. And although accommodations function as necessary legal safeguards given the kind of world we live in, they do nothing to transform a world that is fundamentally structured by the devaluation of disability and of disabled lives. Indeed, my work and the work of many other scholars shows that the highly stratified bureaucratic system, which determines how and which disabilities can be accommodated, often stalls efforts toward genuine accessibility. Disability theorist J. Dolmage writes succinctly, quote, "Accommodations are accommodations. They cannot promise anything like actual real access," end of quote. Dolmage in this quote is expressing a deceivingly simple idea. Accommodations are not access. Yet this is our dominant framework for thinking about the provision of access. If our taken for granted way of thinking about access is flawed, then we must go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves what actual real access is and what it feels like for disabled people. Disability scholars and activists have argued for decades that social and interpersonal arrangements and relations are foundational to the forms of exclusion and limitation experienced by disabled people, as well as to the lived experience of disability. Bringing together this scholarship and activism with interventions in phenomenology and feminist relational theory, I argue that our thinking about access must shift conceptually and methodologically in the direction of a greater philosophical and political recognition of the inherently social and relational character and stakes of bodily life. A relational approach to access begins with the recognition that people are, and here I'm quoting Christine Kogel, Amy Harbin, and Jennifer Lewin, the recognition that people are, quote, necessarily born into and shaped by and acting in and through relationships, end of quote. In sum, there is no outside of relationships. Relationality must function as our primary unit of analysis for understanding what access means, why it is relevant to human lives, and how questions of access are connected to the structures of oppression that operate in and shape our relationship with our own selves, with others, and with the world. My analysis of access right now, and I'm developing this kind of talk on the relationality of access into a chapter of my dissertation, my analysis for now highlights relationality on 5 interconnected levels, which I'll briefly present. I'm still in the process of developing these aspects and my thinking about them, so I would welcome feedback on any aspect of this talk, but specifically on these kind of 5 relational features of access. So I'm going to list them. The first one is that access is not a discrete thing in the world. Access has a relational structure and describes the quality of a relationship. The second one is that access affirms the value of interdependence, vulnerability, and connectedness, and challenges ideals of independence, invulnerability, and mastery. Third, I argue that access has relational stakes, so both intrapersonal, interpersonal, and social institutional. So that access both concerns and impacts relationships with self, relationships with others, and the relationships that we have with social worlds and with institutions. Fourth, I argue, and this is a point that's been used by disability activists, in particular disability justice activists, that access must be created collectively and that it suffers from being individualized. And fifth, I argue that practicing access helps us develop and sharpen important relational capacities. So in what remains of my time today, I'm going to focus on the first of these 5 aspects, but I'm happy to answer questions about the 4 other ones, although they're not fully developed yet. So the first step in changing how we think about access is to recognize that access is not a discrete and measurable thing that we can point to in the world. Access, I would argue, is not the presence of a ramp outside a building, a quiet room at a conference, or the alternative text that accompanies images on a website. Of course, there exist things which we can point to in the world that accommodate the needs of persons in ways that make certain spaces and activities accessible to them. For example, a recording device, a ramp, an elevator, etc. But access itself is not those things, which is why, if you recall, Dolmage reminds us that accommodations are accommodations, not access. The colloquial ways in which we speak about access seem to get this kind of dynamic and relational aspect of access right. In everyday speech, access denotes a transitive relation of obtaining or achieving between at least 2 terms. Access to information is made possible by websites, classrooms, documents. A person may have access to certain privileges within an institution based on her role and function therein. A person may lose access to health insurance when she is unemployed. Access to a learned language that a person has not spoken for years can slowly disappear over time, as can our access to our own memories. In each of these cases, a relationship is being described. For example, between a user and an interface, a person and institutional privileges, a worker and health benefits, a speaker and a language, and a person and their memories. Access describes a particular way we have of relating to relevant things in the world. It captures, thus, a relationship between terms, an interactive and dynamic phenomenon, rather than a discrete object or property of objects. Within the field of disability studies and within histories of disabled activism, the notion of access retains this relational structure. Discussions of access often invoke the relationship between a person and her physical environment. The image of a wheelchair user confronted to a flight of stairs is frequently employed to illustrate how a disabled person's relationship to their environment can be obstructed, quite literally, by architectural barriers. Disability studies scholar Tanya Tichkowski advances a relational view of access when she suggests that access denotes a relationship, quote, between people and places, end quote. She further specifies that, quote, access is a way people have of relating to the ways they are embodied as beings in the particular places they find themselves. So I'll read that again. Access is a way people have of relating to the ways they are embodied as beings in the particular places they find themselves. The ways in which we are embodied and the places where we find ourselves are differentially shaped by racist, heterosexist, classist, ableist, and colonial systems and histories. Our embodied situation in the world and the ways in which we relate to it are deeply impacted by the contingencies of these systems and histories and by the various ways in which they constrain or enable us. Thinking of access as a relation asks that we carefully examine how the uneven distribution of power and privilege shapes relations of access all the way down. The relationship between people and places does not exhaust the sets of relationships in which questions of access arise. The relationship that we have with ourselves, with institutions, systems, resources, practices, traditions, environments, and other persons are also marked by forms of accessibility and inaccessibility. In fact, many, if not all, aspects of our lives, how we move, perceive, feel, interact, learn, and play together, can be interpreted through the lens of access. As Tichkowski puts it, quote, every single instance of life can be regarded as tied to access. That is, to do anything is to have some form of access, end of quote. Tichkowski's claim is not, I'm sure, that we should flatten the meaning of access such that it becomes impossible to notice when inaccessibility functions to exclude disabled people. Rather, she is inviting us to pay closer attention to the claim that access only follows some bodies around. By strategically and temporarily decoupling access from disability, Tichkowski exposes both the assumption that disability signals an intrinsic deficiency that requires accommodation and the many ways in which both disabled and non-disabled people benefit from access measures. After becoming disabled following a traumatic brain injury, Kate Lindemann recalls noticing how the accommodations that allowed her to participate in university life were perceived very differently than those employed by her non-disabled colleagues. Lindemann's computer reminder program was offered as an accommodation. Meanwhile, her colleagues' answering machines were not seen as accommodations, even though they allowed them to field calls while performing their work. Some forms of access are noticeable as accommodations, others are not. Socially sedimented norms around cognitive and physical capacity, behavior, comportment, affect, sensation, and communication are at play in how we engage with most worldly phenomena. These norms reflect the implicit privileging of specific modes of participation in the world. Some forms of access are naturalized as the way things are, while others recede into the background, while others become manifest. If access indeed emerges from the knitted relationship between our existence as embodied beings and the particularities of the world around us, then questions of access extend far beyond the scope of disability. This realization, I think, is very important because it invalidates the ableist assumption that non-disabled people simply do not need access, and that access only enters the room with disability in the form of a problem that must be dealt with. However, I'm equally suspicious of theorizations of access that are completely divorced from the political activism and lived experiences of disabled people. Systemic barriers to access have historically excluded and continue to exclude disabled people from full participation in social life. The creation of access, I think, is centrally connected to the liberation of disabled people and to the full recognition of disabled people's right to flourishing and to self and collective realization. So this is a kind of fine line that I'm trying to thread, and I would welcome thoughts about this. And I think the previous talk touched on it as well, but about the relationship between access and disability and how to develop a view of access that is kind of comprehensive and that doesn't limit itself to disability, but at the same time that perhaps recognizes an inheritance to disabled activism and to some claims that are central to disability theorizing. So at present, this is how I kind of deal with this, by saying that my approach to access extends the politics of access beyond the category of disability, highlighting important limitations with strictly identity-based approaches to disability and to accessibility, but it remains fully committed to disability justice, and it builds on scholarly work and activism by disabled people. To speak of access is not merely to name or describe the relationship between two things. It is also to speak of the quality and the existential relevance of this relationship, as well as of its impacts on a person's life and on the lives of others. I am not interested in a politics of access that values access to all and any things for all people and always. There are things in the world which we do not have access to without this necessarily being a salient issue. Further, there may be good reasons why some avenues of access are foreclosed for some people, and the language of access can all too easily be perniciously wedded to settler colonial agendas of appropriation and expropriation. Recognizing the personal and political importance of access need not entail embracing a fantasy of unbridled control of the world. The forms of access which interest me concern our relationship to the world as a meaningful place in which we exist as human beings in a rich existential sense. I am interested in access as it relates to our possibilities for flourishing, for expressing ourselves and being understood, for having our dignity recognized, and for realizing life projects, tasks, and activities that are significant to us and to the people around us. Access is relational, thus, in a first sense, because, as I said, it cannot be reduced to a single element or component of the world. It has a relational structure. But access is also relational in the deeper sense that it fundamentally concerns our lives as beings that exist in relationships. The most foundational of these relationships is our relationship to the world as a milieu which we can feel ourselves to be a part of, and in which we can act, feel, and think as complexly embodied human beings whose intrinsic value and potential contributions are recognized. On this richer account, the aim of creating access is not to allow disabled people to approximate states of ability or to make fits out of disability misfits. It is to generate possibilities for meaningful worldly engagement and participation across various ways of moving, sensing, feeling, and being. Cultivating access is also a radical political praxis that directly challenges the racist, sexist, ableist, queerphobic, and transphobic systems in our lives that deliberately impoverish, harm, or undermine these possibilities, and that damage or restrict intrapersonal, interpersonal, and social institutional relationships. Creating access, in the words of disability activist Mia Mingus, is not about accessing, quote, the current system or the burning house, end of quote. It is about dismantling the system and rebuilding the world. This can only happen, however, if we move access, quoting Mingus again, out of the realm of only logistics and into the realm of relationships, end of quote. In order to do this, we must recognize the relationality of access. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corinne. So if everyone would put your questions and comments in the Q&A, then I will be able to present them to Corinne. And as we're waiting for some questions, I thought I could start us off. Oh, here, Jonathan has a question. Jonathan, go ahead.
No, that happened last time. In the last one, I asked the first question just as the chair was saying. So Sally, you go ahead and ask your question. I'll come in after.
Oh, mine's quite open-ended, but I thought I would turn to the issue of access created collectively. And I would love it if you would say a little bit more about the process by which access can be created collectively, especially when people have different sort of modalities of disability and ability, et cetera. And if you had suggestions of how that collective process might work.
Yeah, thank you. I think this kind of, to me, is connected with August's claim earlier that that creating access is bound to also that creating access is not an entirely smooth process, which is how I see it. So there's bound to be problems, there's bound to be conflicts, and there's bound to be both incompatible access needs and other types of incompatibilities between persons, which is why I think that it does not work at all to create it individually. I think that we're in a much better position to see these kinds of incompatibilities or frictions and conflicts when we think of access as a collective level, rather than when we think about it as, you know, through the lens of accommodations, again, as something that follows people around and that they can just kind of plug into the room that they're in. And so I think that the idea of creating access collectively is going to look very different depending on what stands as the collective, whether that's, a group of friends, a community, a society more broadly. And I think that maybe to give a succinct answer, I think that part of it is that is again goes back to this idea of access being a kind of temporally open-ended and dynamic process, because there's going to be a lot of playing around and trying things out before we figure out what forms of access work for people. And so it's not going to be, I think, something that's going to be created in one kind of swoop, but rather more of a kind of open-ended project.
So part of why I'm interested in this is that I work on co-design. And the process of co-design, one of the first things you do is teach people the design process and, identify the problems and brainstorm, et cetera. And then you go round and around this iterative process of, and I'm interested in doing that in lots of different kinds of contexts. And it seemed very suitable to this. So if you're in a classroom or if you're in a setting where there's multiple challenges, then beginning a design process could be a co-design process, could be one way to think about doing this collectively. And so that's why it prompted my thinking about it. So thank you so much. So Jonathan Wolf, and then Jonathan Mitchell.
Thank you. So yeah, very, very interesting, and new ways of thinking. I think that so I work in a school of public policy, and this is our question will always be, how do you do this? And what are the levers of change? And so, are we looking at law reform? Are we looking at showing people they have a commercial incentive to make changes? Are we talking about goodwill, leading by example? So the overall change of mindset is also going to be a process. And I'm wondering if you have had thoughts about how this might work, or whether there are already successful examples that we might use as a type of leadership. So, and very much following on, I think, from Sally's question. You're muted, Corinne.
Thank you. So thanks for the question. I think my answer to that is that there would be different, I'm not sure how to say it, different things happening at the same time. I'm, no legal expert, but, certainly there are people doing work that is more maybe focused on transforming legislation. I think that there will need to be, I have kind of work in which I examine more specifically or take issue with specific aspects of, for example, the process of obtaining accommodations as a disabled student. And I think that there's lots of work to be done there, but that will require major kind of legal changes. And so, for example, in my kind of experience as a disabled professor dealing with this in a classroom, I tend to kind of craft an alternative policy for access in my classroom that incorporates and recognizes the kind of more formal process for applying for accommodations at the university, but then also, and to go back to your question, Sally, then also kind of considers students in the classroom perhaps as co-designers or as collaborators in terms of, well, there are all of these problems with this legal model, which I still encourage you to pursue if you'd like to. But then, in our classroom, how are we going to deal with access? Like, what do we want access to mean? What do we need as a group? And how are we going to kind of revise this process? So I know that's not I think your question is a huge one, and my answer is a very small one, but I think that having as many kind of strategies going on at the same time is going to be really important, because the broader kinds of changes that we need are going to take very long.
Great. So I have a question here from Jonathan Mitchell. Jonathan says, thank you so much for a wonderful paper. I agree with everything you said about access and found your schematization of different dimensions very helpful. I wonder whether access also involves care or a kind of care work, and that it needs maintenance and is dynamic and temporal. And we know well that some types of access or affordance are better maintained than others. And then an addendum, and perhaps thinking of it via care allows us to bring those ethical resources to bear.
Yes, thank you. I really love that question. I mean, that's a kind of longer term project, but it's very much something that I want to think more about. And I'm thinking here specifically of Joel Michael Reynolds, the last chapter in Joel Michael Reynolds' book, The Life Worth Living, in which he develops maybe a kind of, or like the chapter is not so much about what access is, but rather inspired by the literature on care, but in which I think he develops something like, you know, a theory of access as a form of care, or of care as always involving some kind of access work. So I don't have a kind of fully developed idea about that, but I really do want to, I think that now I'm at a very kind of descriptive stage of the process where I'm like, what is this thing that we call access? But then I'm also very concerned with like, what are the ways of doing access that are better than others? And like, you know, who bears responsibility for creating access? Like what kinds of moral responsibilities do we have towards others? How is that connected to, you know, questions that the field of care ethics has raised and relational ethics has raised for a very long time? So hopefully by bringing out these relational features, I can then kind of operate a shift toward thinking about the relationship between access and care. So I appreciate you kind of bringing that up.
Great. So there's a question in the chat from Kristen Rodier. And Kristen says, how do you deal with the instability of the concept of access, both ameliorating the concept and describing its limits? Is the concept irretrievably individualized?
Thank you, Kristen. Also good to hear from you on the chat. Yeah, I've been asked this question before. Like, I've been asked if what I was doing was trying to kind of salvage a concept that maybe is like comes with so many associations that I don't want, or like I can't really do that kind of conceptual engineering of saving the notion of access. But I think that whereas the notion of accommodations is irretrievably individualized, I don't think that the notion of access is. I think that that it's going to take a lot of work to kind of to get people to not think of access strictly as accommodations, which is a kind of habit of thought that we have. But I think that if we really focus on access itself, I think that it's a really, really rich notion that's actually not individualized. And I think that that's why I want to develop that more. But I think that the ways in which we talk about access outside of perhaps disability access or the politics of access, I think that access has a really interesting kind of relationality inherent to it. I think that access is also something that shifts temporally and shifts spatially in ways that are very interesting, and that always put us in relation with other people, with other things in the world. So hopefully, yes, it is going to be possible in this dissertation to kind of show that that the concept is not irretrievably individualized, and that there's actually some really interesting work that we can do with it, and that the instability that's inherent to the concept is maybe even helpful for developing the implications of this kind of politics and ethics of access beyond the category of disability, which is something that I do want to do, even if, as I mentioned, like as a person, I'm very indebted to work and activism coming from disability.
Great. Okay, now a question from Emily Douglas. So Emily says, I'm thinking about your great paper in relationship to some of the practices of the accessibility audit practice, going into a building usually and determining its accessibility. What does your thinking offer in response to the kinds of accessibility checklists we might have for spaces, events, etc., which are pragmatic, but also always incomplete? What modes of determining or prepping access should or could we use?
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm just going to reread it. Yeah, so on this, I think that the quote that I ended with, the Mia Mingus quote, that's just like, just access cannot, like access is partly about logistics. Like there are logistical things that we need to work through, but access cannot, you know, strictly be kind of kept in the realm of logistics. We just have to talk to people and we have to work together as people, which obviously she's saying something much bigger when she says that we need to move it toward the realm of relationships. And actually, I think that, and then I should have mentioned this, I've been trying to figure out, this is just a little parenthesis, but I've been trying to figure out, you know, who out there is kind of developing a relational view of access, even if they don't necessarily call it that. And I think that Mia Mingus is one of like my primary resources. So I think that, yes, I think the reason why it's incomplete is because it doesn't involve people and persons and relationships, and it doesn't, and looking at, you know, considering accessibility through a checklist doesn't really tell us anything about how people experience certain spaces. So the chapter that precedes this in the dissertation is the one called The Senses of Access. And in that chapter, this is really the problem that I kind of grapple with, right? We have all of these policies, these checklists, these procedures, best practices, but, you know, no one's really asking disabled people what access feels like for them or what inaccessibility feels like for them. So in that chapter, I'm really kind of sticking to the kind of sensory and affective realm and looking at different kind of first-person descriptions of accessibility and inaccessibility and trying to work through these very like richly affective and sensory descriptions of what access feels like, which is something that we can't get to if we just kind of go through a space with a checklist. Although going through the space with the checklist might also be part of what needs to be done.
I could follow up a bit on that. I mean, one thing I find, my husband, by the way, is in a wheelchair and is disabled, and we travel some. And what I find is that people will often say that a room, say in a hotel, is accessible, or that something is accessible, but it's not possible to access with a wheelchair. And so in terms of the accessibility audits, I often, and I've talked about this at MIT architecture too, you need to get in a wheelchair and try and do it. And so the audit can't just be about going through a building with a checklist, because able-bodied people tend to be quite ignorant about what's actually involved in getting around the world, say in a wheelchair or with other forms of disability. And so I think that for me, some way of kind of extending the experience to people who've never had that experience is deeply important. I don't know if and it can't always be done. Certainly it can't always be done, but when it can, I think it's really important. Maybe put it also in schooling, have people in school go through, try to navigate a building without sight or without hearing or without mobility. I think it's important, but I don't know, maybe that was just an aside because it triggered one of my pet peeves
regarding that. So first, the fact that yes, like many spaces that are marked as accessible, when a space is marked as accessible, and I think Tanya Tichkowski's book does really, really great work about this, that a space being marked as accessible does not mean that everybody and anybody will experience it as accessible, and does not always mean that the people, designers had in mind will find it accessible. And there's this really, so I'm using three kind of, I call them sensory metaphors in the chapter on the senses of access. And one of them is this idea of Tanya Tichkowski, who when she got her job at the University of Toronto, kind of went through various buildings and kind of, checked basic accessibility features. And she describes how one of the bathrooms that was marked as accessible was not in fact accessible, such that when the door opened, the person was confronted to a very tight corner. And so she describes the room feeling, or like the room feeling like a tight squeeze. And so I'm kind of using that image of access as a tight squeeze to connect it to what I'm calling ableist access, right? So this idea that, you know, some forms of access are just so thoroughly incomplete that they, you know, involve so many contortions and so much bodily discomfort that they have nothing to do with access. And then I definitely agree about, you know, the importance of education, but I don't think that that can happen through kind of simulations of disability experience. I think that incorporating disability education in curriculum is really important, but I don't think that for various reasons, I don't think that disability simulations, so a sighted person, so I think that those are quite problematic, but that certainly educating people about accessibility itself, which I think can be done in many ways. Like when I hand out my syllabus and my students see that I have a section called access in our classroom, they're like, oh, like, what is this? And then we just talk about access, and that's kind of nice. And they're like, oh, I didn't really know that this was a thing, because I just know about, you know, disability services. I didn't know that I could tell you that I would really like this or that in the class. So I think that for those of us who are teachers, that's also a nice way to introduce those conversations.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you that attempting at simulation is not adequate. I'm just kind of, sometimes, as you pointed out in the case of buildings, there's basic information about widths and heights and stuff that somehow need to be better addressed. So we have another question. This is from Naomi Sheeman. Does it help to think in terms of what's needed in order for everyone to have access to the contributions, perspectives, etc., of disabled people, for them to participate fully in ways that make them full contributors to whatever we are all up to?
I'm just going to reread that. I think I'm not entirely clear on the question. I don't know, Naomi, if you could, I know it's a little hard in writing, because it's hard to think in terms of what's needed. Oh, there you are.
Oh, Naomi's there. Hi, Naomi.
Hi. Yes, I was thinking about relationally, the idea of thinking of access in the other direction. That is, when I think about writing accessibly, it's so other people can have our good stuff rather than whom do I listen to, whom do I learn from. And so thinking about what's needed in order for all of us, including non-disabled people, to have access to the contributions of disabled people. In other words, what's needed in order for them to bring what they know, what their perspectives are, into the conversation so the rest of us can listen them. So it's sort of flipping the directionality of access.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, that's very interesting. I don't know that I have an immediate response, but I do like the idea of considering, which maybe shows me a kind of a way that I've framed relationality as starting from one place rather than another. So I think I'll just kind of make a note of that and try to think more about it, because I think that what you're asking is also really important in terms of understanding and theorizing relationships between disabled people and non-disabled people more broadly. So yeah, so I don't have an answer, but I am making a note of this.
So we have, so thank you, Naomi. Thank you to all of the questioners who've already asked, and to Corinne for her great responses. But we have like 1 more minute if there's another quick follow-up, or you can throw it in the chat or in the Q&A. Okay. Corinne, is there anything you'd like to say to kind of close us out?
No, just thank you for your questions. And it's good. I'm very, very happy that I could present this work here.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all of you who've come to the session, and And we're very, very lucky to have this opportunity to get together to talk about these important issues. So thank you, Shelley and Jonathan, and to Jamie, who's doing our AV support. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for a great session. What a great way to end the day off. Thank you very much.
So let me add my thanks as well. And we hope to see many of you back again tomorrow. But what an incredible day. Amazing presentations and very illuminating discussions as well.